Welcome to the sixth and final panel of our conference on how wars end. The focus of this panel is transitions to peace. The first topic in transitions to peace is transitional justice, introduced by the University of Sydney's Department of Peace and Conflict Studies Director, Dr. Wendy Lambourne. He acknowledges that peace isn't merely the conclusion of direct violence of war and explores the tensions between peace and justice and between reconciliation and prosecution. Wendy is followed by Colonel Marcus Fielding, President of the Society for Military History, who shares his perceptions of the inflection points in four conflicts by way of personal anecdotes: the Mujahideen takeover of Afghanistan in April 1992, the US-led intervention in Haiti in 1994, the Australian-led intervention in East Timor in 1999, and the withdrawal of coalition forces from Iraq in late 2009. Finally, Dr. David Kilcullen examines endgame dynamics in civil wars, using the end of the Afghanistan War, or at least the end of the West's involvement in that war, as a case study. So let me start by introducing our first speaker. Dr. Wendy Lambourne is Director of the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. Dr. Lambourne's research has led her to propose a model of transformative justice that incorporates psychological, political and socio-economic as well as legal justice, a focus on the future as well as the past, and the importance of localisation and contextualisation. As an adjunct to this research, she argues for the significance of trauma healing and psychosocial interventions for transitional justice and peace building. Wendy.
So I wanted to start this presentation by saying that this is a work in progress. It's building on research that I started over 20 years ago, looking at the peace agreement in Cambodia and the culture of impunity at that time, and trying to understand the issues that affect how justice or transitional justice is part of a peace agreement, and how that then affects the transition from war to peace, and particularly the process of peace building that helps to consolidate that peace and to build that peace in a sustainable or transformative way. So the concept of peace with justice is the overall framing for what I'm talking about. And of course, recognizing that peace is more than the ending of war. So then what does that transition from war to peace mean, and how is it linked to the pursuit of justice? And I wanted to give a nod out here to Johan Galtung and others who talked about the distinction between negative peace and positive peace, just to reinforce that idea that the absence of direct violence or the ending of the armed conflict is a concept of negative peace, as in it hasn't done anything to particularly build peace for the future, which is the idea of a positive peace or a peace with justice. So I also wanted to just mention briefly the definition of peace building from the UN Security Council back in 2001 as a comprehensive idea about what peace building entails, including the concept of sustainability and inclusive of security, of course, as well as the political, the economic, and the justice spheres. At this point, justice is being seen as legal justice, yes, and contrasted with political and economic activities that then build a peace that is attending to the need to address the underlying causes of the conflict, which are often economic, socioeconomic, about poverty and inequalities in development, and the idea of respect for human rights and the rule of law is seen as part of the justice sphere. So in terms of transitional justice, more specifically, the UN Secretary General's report from 2004, which is also still quite a while ago, but is a very helpful way of understanding the different goals and methods that were seen to be part of transitional justice at that time. So thinking of the traditional kind of goals of democracy and rule of law, as well as truth, accountability, reconciliation, and peace. And part of what I want to talk about is how often when practitioners are thinking about transitional justice, they're ignoring the reconciliation and peace goals and taking more account of the accountability, legal justice goals, which can sometimes create that tension of peace versus justice rather than this potential for peace and justice, or peace with justice. And then just a brief thumbnail sketch of the different methods that transitional justice can take into account. Yeah, so you can have amnesties, you can have lustration and vetting of preventing those who are accused of atrocities in the past from participating in the governance structure of the country in the future. And amnesties is a particular method, yes, so that can help to give an amnesty can help the parties to come to the peace agreement, right? So again, this is creating this tension between peace and justice. And then other kinds of methods, of course, the main ones that we think about are criminal trials and truth commissions these days, but also reparations and institutional reform and memorialization and how that links in with those other methods, and the idea of using different traditional practices as distinct from the Western European kind of North American as well, of course, but the Western kind of model of what legal justice might look like, but also looking at what are the kind of traditional practices and methods that might coexist or might exist in those countries from the past or currently. So in terms of also trying to understand this tension or potential between peace versus justice and peace with justice, looking at what then transpired to be the key pillars in UN practice, as distinct from the kind of theoretical idea that it's an all-encompassing approach to justice and peace, but something that what happens when the UN narrows this down, well, I see it as narrowing down into these key pillars, or that the United Nations identified in 2010, then you see prosecution comes in as the key idea about justice, which is a narrow idea, right? It's narrower than accountability. It's narrower than justice. It's a very specific kind of justice, you know? And what I argue is the one that creates the tensions with the other kinds of aspects of justice. And so that prosecution approach comes very specifically from from Joinet's Principles Against Impunity, the second one there listed as right to justice, right? As seen as prosecution, because it's about ending impunity. Yeah. Then the other key pillars, truth-seeking processes, which is linked to the right to know, reparation programs linked to the right to reparation, institutional reform linked to the idea of a guarantee of non-recurrence, that one of the best ways of guaranteeing that those kind of atrocities won't be recurring in the future is to have some kind of reform of the institutions in that country, including, of course, the rule of law. So those ideas that kind of like focus on prosecutions, that's, as I was saying, where those peace versus justice tensions can come up. And my question, of course, when I looked at this was, well, what happened to reconciliation as a goal? Yeah, and how is this consistent or not with reconciliation that one might see as necessary for peace or peace building? Just a brief mention also of the fifth key pillar of national consultations, which was the United Nations approach to making sure that civil society that was participating, and well, not civil society actually, their focus has been much more on national governments. So it's about local participation, which is meaning national government's participation and consultation, not necessarily civil society that goes beyond the government. So this is the model which Swiss Peace came up with to illustrate these four key pillars. And part of the reason I wanted to show the diagram is because when you look under the right to justice, you see that they're very explicitly things that link to ideas of prosecutions, right, of legal justice, yeah. And you see under right to reparation and right to know links to you know, truth commissions and restitution, rehabilitation, but also memorialization and documentation as other key aspects of transitional justice that do get emphasized in the traditional approach. And then under guarantee of non-recurrence, you see not only the idea of institutional reform, but it's also seeing how lustration or vetting, as saying before, can contribute to a guarantee of non-recurrence, as well as some of the more traditional peace agreement conditions and peace building approaches to disarmament, demobilization, reintegration of former combatants, as well as security sector reform, as well as the legal sector. So again, in bringing together the concepts of transitional justice and peace building, the idea that by having a focus as a peace building as the context for transitional justice, so what's happening in this transition, how is it consistent with peace building for the future, right? That's the idea about linking the past. How do we link dealing with the past with building for the peace for the future, rather than seeing them as separate things, right? So that has been what's happened in a lot of cases in the past. And probably still currently, whether if there's a focus on dealing with the past, sometimes it forgets about what's needed for building peace for the future in those communities with the people who are concerned, who are most affected by the violence and need to live together again. So if we're in that context of where people need to live together, who have perpetrated violations against each other in the past, then you need to think about concepts like reconciliation and what does it mean to those people to build peace in that context. So that's what sort of brings to the expansion of the idea about going beyond legal accountability through prosecutions and the rule of law to thinking about other justice needs. Yeah, so thinking particularly around socioeconomic and political justice needs. And that's come partly from my research as well as other scholarship recently, of emphasizing the of what peace means to people on the ground in those situations. Yeah, so what does peace mean to them? And often the answer I will get is it means having enough food to eat, or it has enough, or it means being able to send my children to school. Yeah, those kind of responses. And it means being able to trust my government, being able to believe that they will provide for us. And those kind of responses are seen in the artworks from the National Vision for Sierra Leone that I've got 2 photographs that I took from 2006 during the competition. And I don't know if you can see it in the size on the screen. Can't make it any bigger, but that the people who contributed those artworks included ideas about having enough food to eat, right? And even safe sex as being part of something to do with peace, right? It's like, how do we protect ourselves? How do we have security for our health and our education in the future? So that's the sort of the first of those 3 points there. The second one is clarifying about being more than retributive justice, being more than about punishment. It's also about the need for restorative justice, the idea of people restoring relationships in the community, restoring communities, right? Which could be seen as or called and conceptualized as reconciliation or as psychosocial healing. As different ideas that can contribute to a different kind of justice that goes beyond punishment. It's not about saying that we have to have one or the other, but thinking about how can we have plans for peace agreements and peace building and transitional justice that has a more holistic approach that includes different ways of looking at that. And then finally, of course, that when we're looking at transitional justice, the idea that it's more than transitional. So that's something I've talked about in other parts of my research, about setting up not only structures and institutions, but also relationships within that community, within that country, to promote transformation as well as sustainability. So this is about transforming structures, about transforming relationships that is part of that transitional process, but continues. Yeah, so it's not something that can be just sort of tick a box and then it's over. It is about transforming something in a more sustainable way. So coming back to the peace versus justice tension with the peace with justice, the question of how are peace building and transitional justice goals and methods affected by the characteristics of the peace process and the interests and capacities of stakeholders. Now, this is something that I based on field research, but also other cases that I read about, creating a kind of a structure of thinking about, number one, who is deciding on the type of justice mechanism and who is it for. Yeah, so they're not necessarily the same thing, right? So the United Nations, for example, where is it up here? Part of the international community under this kind of setup, could be deciding on a transitional justice process that it thinks is best for the local communities, right? So it's not about that it's necessarily the same thing about by whom and for whom are coming up with the same answers, but rather how do these different actors, sorry, went prematurely to the next slide, the different actors of the government of the day, of the country where the transition is being taken place, the international community, the United Nations, but also broadening out this idea of international community to include specifically international lawyers as well as international civil society. Could be international human rights advocates, they could be local human rights advocates, but particularly also transitional justice experts or consultants, and I count myself as one of those. What do people say about transitional justice? How has that influenced the attitudes towards justice as part of a peace agreement over time? As well as the local communities, and a group that often gets left out is the people from that country themselves who are no longer in the country. So the refugees and the diaspora communities, and how are they included or not included in the decisions about the type of peace process, the type of transitional justice process, as well as in the implementation. So these different conditions, right? So there's three kind of categories of aspects of the termination or the transition from war to peace, broadly speaking, that I want to talk about. One is about the conditions of the conflict itself and its termination. So to do with how the violence was terminated. Was it by a peace agreement or by military victory is quite critical. Yeah, in terms of who has the power and the responsibility to decide about not only the content of the peace agreement, but what happens with the implementation of any justice mechanisms afterwards. The balance of power between the previously warring parties, the existence of a continuing threat of violence and how that can influence the kind of peace agreement process. And the example I mentioned before of Cambodia, that the continuing threat of potential violence from the Khmer Rouge, who's still existing at that time of the peace agreement, was part of the thinking about including the Khmer Rouge in the peace agreement itself, and including them as possibly standing for election as part of the Cambodian peace elections. So democratic elections, I mean. Also things about the level of pervasiveness of brutality and suffering. So how extreme were the atrocities, and also the proportion of the population involved in the violence and perpetration of crimes. Is this just, some leaders? Is it a mass thing like in Rwanda with the genocide, right? So where you find that, like almost the whole of the population are involved in the perpetrator group, inverted commas, was involved in perpetrating that violence. So that can make a huge difference as well to the type of approach to justice in a peace agreement. Then, of course, then I'm going to talk about the interests and capacities of the international community, and then the interests and capacities of the local community. So first of all, with the international one, you have the idea of the national interests of the major players, right? So the national interests, meaning, of course, the states who are part of the United Nations, yeah, as well as the national interests of the government itself and of major countries with an interest in that peace agreement. So, for example, in the Cambodian peace agreement, the Australian government had a perceived national interest in being part of what would happen with that peace agreement, yeah, as well as I was mentioning before, thinking about the future of the country itself, and regional security issues to take into account. And how does that tie up within ideological priorities and allegiances, such as Cold War allegiances or war on terror allegiances, or whatever kinds of allegiances that governments have, including ideological priorities such as communism versus capitalism in the past. The capacity of states or other actors to influence or intervene, so their actual capacity, their power in that process. There's different levels of power in that process. The jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, of course, is a newer issue to take into account, and a very, very important one that has affected the perceptions about peace versus justice versus peace with justice as part of peace agreements, when you've got an international criminal court that has a permanent jurisdiction and that can be seen and can and has played a role in opening investigations about alleged human rights violations during the past violence, or at the time of, or even before the negotiations for peace agreement. So how does that affect that? You know, the fact that there can be some jurisdiction coming from outside the country and from outside the negotiators who are actually, you know, concerned with that peace agreement. How does that affect the kind of justice mechanisms that can be introduced? Of course, overall, the level of commitment to human rights and the duty to prosecute coming from those key pillars and from those Leone principles. And that's talking about, you know, over historically, right? So the commitment to human rights has evolved over time, and the idea of the duty to prosecute developed over the last 20, 30 years since we've had this concept of transitional justice. Yeah. So, and of course, the obvious one of perceptions about the compatibility of peace and justice. So whether those who are in the international community recognize this compatibility, or that we can be looking for justice as part of a peace process, or whether they're seen as somehow separate ideas, that if the International Criminal Court is pursuing a case, an investigation against one of the parties in the conflict, you know, is that perceived as compatible with a peace agreement, and those kind of things. And then particularly I came from, these particularly come from examples of genocide, or really extreme atrocities, where you think about the case of Rwanda, for example, where the extent of moral outrage, the shock about what had happened and what the international community had allowed to happen and not prevented, not stopped, not worked out how to stop, as well as the need to assuage that guilt for not intervening to prevent those atrocities, which again you can see might relate to the Rwandan genocide, that providing this kind of combination of shock and shame that led to the immediate part of what led to the creation of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda by the international community, as distinct from having taken action to try to prevent that genocide from occurring, but following up on the other part of the Genocide Convention of a kind of obligation or responsibility to prosecute, to punish those who had perpetrated that violence. So then we have the interests and capacities of the local community. So of course there's the goals and interests of the political leaders themselves in that country, and that's really, really critical. You can see that contrast between the political leaders' goals in, say, Burundi and Rwanda as part of peace processes, and what's happened with transitional justice in those two countries. And if I have time, I'll talk a little bit more about that example later. Then there's the local capacity for conducting legal trials, of course. It's like, how's the country perceived? How is that new, that transitional state moving forward seen as capable of conducting legal trials in a way that will be trusted, that is seen as being, that the system is not only capable of doing that in terms of having sufficient legal professionals, but also having sufficient lawyers, etc. But also in terms of the trust that the population may or may not have for that. And I remember very clearly talking with people in Sierra Leone back in 2006, that was primarily, but also again in 2016, sadly. That's a judgment, but I thought it was sadly that in both cases, people were talking about not trusting the government, yes, we would like to see legal trials, but we don't trust our government to do that kind of thing, or to even trusting them to have memorialization that would be inclusive. Yeah. So then the local capacity to maintain peace and security, of course, has a role as well, because I'm trying to understand the balance, or to make decisions about the balance between peace and security. The balance between peace and justice. If the capacity to maintain that peace and security is really weak, then the emphasis on peace might, be seen to take more priority over justice in that kind of situation. Again, the level of commitment to human rights and rule of law in the national or local context, and the perceptions about compatibility of peace and justice, as I mentioned before, in relation to the international community, equally applies with the local or national context. The perceived needs of survivors is the one that comes through strongly and has particularly come through in the most recent peace agreement and transitional justice process that I've just started to analyse in relation to Colombia, and the really important inclusion of this sense of what's happening for the victims as influencing the peace agreement. The extent to which the community of survivors and perpetrators need to be reintegrated. That's what I mentioned before around if people need to live together again, as distinct from being separated or being in different geographical locations. If they are living in the same place together, as in Rwanda springs to mind, of course, for an example. Also Colombia, for that matter, and other cases. How does that affect the assessment of what kind of justice are we going to are they going to pursue in that context, and how important is it to have that be something that supports peace building in the future, or sustainable peace, or that people can live together. So then we come to the existence of indigenous or traditional mechanisms for achieving justice and reconciliation, and the capacity or the willingness or relevance or ability to apply those kind of mechanisms for achieving justice and reconciliation today. So, as distinct from, in the past, but now in this particular context, imagining we've just had, like in Rwanda, for example, where they've had different violations, they've had genocide, and then what do we do? How can we deal with this mass number of perpetrators of this violence? So thinking about a kind of method that they might, in this case in Rwanda, of adapting the traditional gacaca mechanism to provide a more mass level sort of justice, but also one that was about not only punishment or retributive justice, but also about the idea of how can this country build reconciliation now? How can we live together after that? So having traditional indigenous mechanisms, informal mechanisms that already include both restorative and retributive elements can help to balance the peace with justice. Yeah. So the idea of peace and justice going together in some of these traditional mechanisms in their own existence is quite different to the idea of having this separate kind of like trials and tribunals, and a truth commission as two separate mechanisms. One's thinking about punishment, retributive justice, the other's thinking about or trying to promote restorative justice or reconciliation as being in two separate mechanisms. Yeah. Whereas the idea that they are often combined into the same kind of thinking in a lot of traditional indigenous mechanisms, like the gacaca process in Rwanda, or the Nahabiti process that was included as part of the Truth Commission in Timor Leste. Not that I'm arguing that they did actually achieve justice and reconciliation. I'm just saying that they could potentially do that. Whereas you see the distinction between, for example, in Sierra Leone, there was the creation of the tribunal and the creation of the Truth Commission separately at the same time, and they didn't cooperate. They weren't. They were supposed to be happening together, but because they weren't designed to be together, there was a disjuncture between them, right? And there wasn't a strong sense of, and that actually undermined the capacity of both institutions to be effective. Whereas you see in Colombia, the plan was to overcome that limitation, and to think about and to plan from the beginning about how would the trials and a truth commission coexist and be complementary and work together. So that kind of thinking, which I sort of building on these different ways of thinking about what's compatible and the different kinds of potential for that, not only from indigenous mechanisms which could helped to move it in that direction. But also we're thinking about, you know, how does this peace, justice, and other issues, how can peace and justice be seen as compatible? What are the different ways of doing that? That's the point of that, is thinking about the different examples. And also
last couple of minutes, Wendy.
Thank you. So the cultural and religious approaches to justice and reconciliation is also really critical here, in terms of thinking about the local kind of approaches to these mechanisms. So if there's a stronger kind of approach to, say, forgiveness as part of a religious tradition, then that can affect the different approaches. So I'm obviously not going to go through the case studies in detail, but I'm quite happy, and if you wanted to contact me to get to be able to access the full lot of slides, which cover these different case examples I've mentioned: Cambodia, Rwanda, Burundi, Timor Leste, Sierra Leone, and I haven't mentioned Northern Uganda, and Sri Lanka and Colombia. So I'm just going to, I always want to say at this moment, close your eyes, because I'm going to go fast through the slides, but I'm just going to, oh, no, sorry, this is really important. I forgot about this one, which is a summary of the case study examples, some of them, to think about what was the format, right? So applying that kind of principles of whether it's an internationally brokered peace agreement, whether it's a regionally brokered peace agreement, whether it's a national peace agreement, whether it's an opposition victory, whether it's a government victory, whether it's UN peace missions, who is involved and how, and mapping those different conditions at the time of the peace agreement onto what kind of transitional justice processes are then pursued. That's the point of that. So this is the part where I go a bit quickly. So there's some ideas about what did happen in Cambodia eventually with the peace agreement, that after the peace agreement, that didn't include justice at all at the time, but then later did involve the setting up of the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. So the idea of peace with delayed justice, that comes out of the particular involvement of parties at different times at the original, well, you could say at the end of the genocide period in the 1970s, then the peace agreement stage in the 1990s, and then when we eventually get the, what were the conditions that enabled the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, the ECCC, to be established, and what kinds of justice were therefore pursued at different times. So, so examples of how people in those local communities responded at different times. So my research in 1999 versus 2009, and some similarities, but also different aspects of talking about the importance of truth in order to have justice. The idea that even having some kind of accountability with the court, even despite any criticisms of how it's actually been able to fulfill its purpose, the sense that can still create some sense of peace for people in the communities. And so that's a bit about Cambodia. I've mentioned a bit about Rwanda already. So the focus very much at the beginning in Rwanda with a military victory changes the dynamics, right, compared with the peace agreement dynamics of Cambodia. So in this case, seeing how there was an ability both and a willingness of both the international community and the local the government in Rwanda to pursue legal justice, to pursue accountability for the perpetrators of those accused of the genocide in that case. So because you have the government that is in power is composed of those who are the victims of the genocide. So primarily, so then that pursuit of justice against one side becomes followed in that case. So the idea that also there was that with the, as I mentioned before about the Gacaca, with a community level justice, but still it was state run. And there was still this sense of, how that in itself didn't contribute to socioeconomic or political justice, other ideas about justice, and the importance of memorialization, I wanted to also mention here, and in relation to Rwanda, the move from a focus early on retributive justice, on prosecutions for the accused, moving towards a recognition that in order to live together after this genocide, after this mass violence, we need to have reconciliation. We need to have a way of moving forward that is going to create unity. So that's Kenya Rwanda for the national unity of national unity and the National Commission on National Unity and Reconciliation. Sorry, I'm feeling the time pressure, as happens whether you're on Zoom or in a real conference. So I mentioned before the contrast with Burundi, where there was a peace agreement, and there was supposed to be a truth commission and prosecutions coming out of that peace agreement, but neither happened because the United Nations was not able to have enough influence to implement what was seen as important transitional justice goals in the face of the Burundian government not wanting to pursue those goals for those kind of reasons we talked about before in terms of national interests. So I'll just skip over Timor for the minute, because I haven't talked about Timor. And in relation to Sierra Leone, I talked before about the having a truth commission and a special court, and the idea that they could have peace with justice potentially was not really fulfilled because of problems with both institutions and a lack of cooperation between them, and a lack of engagement with local communities about the purpose and also the implementation of those mechanisms. There's a lot more I could say about Sierra Leone, but conscious of the time, so I'll move into, although I will say something about the very important sort of follow-up that you see as an example in Sierra Leone that goes beyond those two institutions, so the Special Court for Sierra Leone and the Sierra Leone Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What comes out afterwards in following up particularly after the Truth Commission, setting up Peace Museum and a national vision for Sierra Leone, so trying to build some kind of vision of the future that's linking together ideas of peace and justice. How successful that is another question, but also particularly the important role of local and international civil society in this case, coming together to think about what was missing. So I mentioned before the key pillars of transitional justice coming from the UN at an international level, coming from the human rights and transitional justice consultants and experts, that was focusing primarily on those institutional approaches, and realizing that weren't explicitly focusing on healing or reconciliation. So recognizing something else was needed within the community. So creating the Fumble Talk, family talk, traditional mechanism to apply it in this case. And very briefly, Northern Uganda is important to mention because of the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction over the crimes that were perpetrated, the mass atrocities in Northern Uganda. Because of their jurisdiction, then that created the tensions between what's happening with those who are accused of the Lord's Resistance Army. How do you get Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army to come to some kind of peace agreement when they're being threatened for prosecution by the International Criminal Court? Is that consistent with peace and justice, or is it going to undermine peace and justice? So those kind of dilemmas that play out there, as well as the potential for different kinds of processes, as I mentioned before, and what has actually played out, and how can we understand the decisions. I also mentioned briefly before about Colombia, the comprehensive peace agreement between the government and the former rebel group, the FARC, and that, you know, this was quite a groundbreaking, I think, peace agreement in its comprehensive approach to justice, and really warrants a mention and further analysis and assessment as how things have developed since the peace agreement. But specifically, as I said, setting up this special jurisdiction for peace, as well as a commission, a truth commission, and trying to bring together the idea of focusing on reparations, truth, retributive and restorative justice, and recognizing political and economic crimes. So there's a very ambitious approach to trying to build peace and justice, to have peace with justice in that context. So that, and I'm just moved to my conclusions. So this analyzing and evaluating transitional justice in terms of its contribution to peace building, that idea that it creates a more holistic perspective about the future, dealing with the past and building for the future, building peace for the future, taking into account the needs and expectations of all the parties involved, not just the governments and the international community, but also the people in the local communities, and the different understandings and approaches of the perpetrators, the victims, the survivors, in their needs and expectations, but also how does that affect the final decision, right, about the type of justice that goes with the peace process. So final conclusions, there's no guarantees in transitional justice and peace building that any of these theories, discourses, policies, key pillars will translate into outcomes and practice on the ground. Yeah. So then looking at what does happen on the ground, how is that influenced, and a couple of key points about the national consultations as a fifth pillar in transitional justice, that even though the UN is sort of was showing its commitment to involvement of local ownership in the process, the kind of observation in a lot of these cases about the bottom line, of course, of state sovereignty, retaining control over that process. So this tension between what the national elites in that country are wanting to do in terms of determining the future shape of justice and peace in their country, or not justice and peace in their country, can make a huge makes the most significant difference in terms of the peace versus justice, or peace with justice dilemma. And we see that playing out in Colombia as you know, what's the, you know, sort of questioning the political will of the Colombian government to pursue this holistic, ambitious approach to transitional justice. And finally, the civil society programs and how they're also really, really important to complement or often contradict, or to take place in the absence of national or international led transitional justice processes, as in Burundi is a good example of that, where for many years, and even since the creation of the Truth Commission, which is sort of questionable impact, that those micro level transitional justice and mechanisms and approaches that can be going on at the community at the same time, or instead of a national or international led approach, can really contribute. And how is that taken into account in any kind of macro level peace agreement? Yeah, so understanding that those contributions at different levels. And absolutely, finally, the need to transcend seeing justice issues in dualistic terms, right? So instead of thinking peace versus human rights, or reconciliation versus justice, retributive versus restorative justice, but rather, as I was talking a bit about earlier, seeing them as somehow compatible. Yeah, that how can we have peace and justice at the same time? How can we have retributive and restorative justice at the same time in order to support a sustainable or transformative peace building?
There seems to be, in the conclusion of conflict, of armed conflict, that there will always be some groups which are unhappy about the way the conflict ends, regardless of what type of agreement you come to, how comprehensive you try to be, how inclusive, how transitional, how restorative. But there will always be groups that will feel that they have been wronged by the conflict, that almost no amount of justice can satisfy their claims, and that they will always be outliers in a peace process. on one hand. On the other hand, you have groups which simply won't come to the table if they believe they're going to be prosecuted or if they're going to face some sort of retributive process. And these are fundamental problems in finding peace, which ultimately means, at least in my experience, that there's always going to be people who are unhappy with the process. That's more of an observation, but if I could ask you to comment on that.
Yeah, the first question, part of my answer is the simple one of time. that in terms of like people not feeling included in a peace process or having grievances or still having such, and I'll go back to Rwanda again. It might seem like an old case, but it's really, I think it really helps us to understand that strength of that, what happens immediately after mass atrocities or mass human rights violations of any kind. And it doesn't have to be as extreme as the genocide in Rwanda, but that sense, that overwhelming sense of needing to have some kind of justice that means punishment or it means retribution, yeah, or even revenge possibly. And I've seen that in a number of cases, including Rwanda as well as Cambodia, where that kind of sense of that is their immediate response, right? But then it's like what happens over time and how that might change, right? So how that evolves. And I think part of the answer to that dilemma is recognizing that over time people's will have different approaches to thinking. The emphasis on thinking about peace in the future will start to become more important, right? So the realities. Now, it doesn't mean to say that there aren't still people who will, and certainly that's the case, but then it becomes, well, how do you have a leadership that incorporates and decisions that incorporate that and recognize that need for that kind of justice, so that people feel that is being taken into account. So I guess, it's kind of like, yeah, there's an inevitability about it in some ways, but there's also an inevitability about that people's attitudes and experiences can change and can be affected by others and by their experiences. So I'm not trying to kind of paint this, Pollyanna kind of thing that everything will work out, but rather that thinking about what is possible rather than thinking that it's impossible. What was the second part?
Well, I mean, can I jump in? Because actually, the second part relates to my question as well.
Thanks, David.
And it's really how the role of the ICC in this tension that you described between peace and justice. When you have an organization such as the ICC that has its own jurisdiction, which is external to any of the parties that make a peace agreement, how can you have a peace agreement which has, discussion on transitional justice without it being completely trumped by the ICC? I mean, you talked about Joseph Kony and the LRA. When you're negotiating something, how do you persuade somebody to come out of the jungle, to give up their weapons, to give up their almost unlimited power in their own environment in order to spend the rest of their lives in prison? Where is room for amnesty or compromise when you have an independent body such as the International Criminal Court, which might swoop at any moment to destroy your fragile agreement?
Yeah, no, when the International Criminal Court was created, like many others, I was kind of like, wow, this is fantastic. Like we're not going to be dependent on this sort of ad hoc kind of approach, an uneven approach to accountability for atrocities. And then all of a sudden the reality sets in of like, oh my goodness, the influence that this can have and what difference is this going to make? Like that this International Criminal Court is there. How is that going to affect peace agreements? How is that going to affect the ability of people within a country to pursue the kind of justice that they perceive as going to be most helpful for them to develop peace, right? So that's, whether you mean the government or the local communities or both, that that tension then is there, as you're identifying. Yeah, exactly. It was interesting with Joseph Kony and the LRA because of the different sort of stories that came out there, but the sense that he was afraid of the ICC was really interesting, because it created, in some ways, the potential more for conversation. That's one of the stories that I heard at the time, right? One of the versions of what was happening. And I say that because I haven't done extensive research in that area, but recognizing the complexities of what was happening with the International Criminal Court representatives going into the communities though, and asking people. So there was also what was going on in the local communities in northern Uganda, was trying to find out, you know, and talking about, well, what do you need? And that was really interesting when that did come out. It didn't happen at the beginning, but then it started to sort of become part of the idea of, you know, along with the idea of national consultations, but the idea of actually asking people, how do you see this might be able to be complementary, right? So this was talking with people who were linked with the LRA, as well as talking with people in the local communities who are victims of those atrocities, so those crimes. So I think it does come back, and also a very important part of that is that perception about what does the definition of that the government itself being capable of pursuing justice itself, right? So what is the capacity of a country like Colombia to pursue legal justice in that context, in the way that it wants to do, that then prevents the International Criminal Court from having jurisdiction, because the local, if there is the capacity and willingness to do that within the country itself, yeah. And of course, remembering that the ICC can't operate completely, well, it depends on the chief prosecutor's independence levels, and that's changed over time. But the ability to pursue cases that is a lot of the time driven by the, like in the case of Uganda, of course, the Uganda taking the case to the International Criminal Court. So that to me is as much as part of the issue, rather than just the existence of the International Criminal Court, but the fact that it is state-based in the sense that Uganda could take the case, and therefore the LRA atrocities could be potentially prosecuted. But what about the accusations of atrocities committed by the Ugandan government? So there's a complex kind of interrelationship that creates some potential in some circumstances. And I think that's part of the point of what I was getting at with the presentation overall, is that each circumstance is individual. Yes, you can see some, you know, commonalities, but in some cases, the existence of the International Criminal Court could assist with a peace process, potentially. And in other cases, it could undermine, depending on the parties and their perspectives. So it's not a, you know, like one case all kind of answer, but I totally agree that the existence of the ICC is really thrown up in the air. The ability of those who are negotiating peace agreements to have that kind of control over what's going to be part of that, the justice part of the peace agreement. Yeah. So yeah. And that, what was the, yeah, and how does that influence people coming to the table, coming back to Damien's original question, the willingness to come to the table. So what is there a table? So that's one of the things, like, what is the table, who's at the table? And that's always power driven anyway, right? So who's got more power in the peace negotiation table, if you like, which is one of the reasons I focused on the peace building process as being something that follows, and the idea that over time the what is implemented from that peace agreement can be hugely different, right? You can see the contrast between what happened with the implementation of the peace agreement in Burundi compared with Sierra Leone, right? Yeah. They both had a huge amount of UN involvement, both had peace agreements, and both had governments who you kind of, at the time, with the different ways that the elections, the power sharing versus, what happened next. You could even bring Colombia into that. Cambodia into that. That the difference in what's happened next, and what is it about the influence of the international actors or not in that case, and how could that, and and it comes back to the government leaders and what is their vision and their political will, and how can that be incorporated. Sorry, I'm starting to repeat myself.
No, well, thank you very much. I mean, it's been an incredibly rich period of presentation and answers. There's an awful lot there. What's very clear is no easy answers. It actually follows a theme across the whole of this conference. Otherwise, wars will be much easier to end than they really are.
Marcus Fielding joined the Australian Regular Army in 1983 and graduated from the Royal Military College, Duntroon, as a lieutenant in 1986. Marcus has participated in 4 operational deployments. In 1992, he directed operations to clear landmines in Afghanistan. In 1995, he coordinated infrastructure construction projects in Haiti. In 1999 and 2000, Marcus directly was involved in security operations and coordinated the repatriation of displaced persons as part of the Australian-led international force in East Timor, Interfet. For his work in East Timor, he was awarded a commendation for distinguished service. In 2008 and 2009, Marcus spent 9 months in Baghdad as action officer in the headquarters of the multinational force Iraq. Colonel Fielding transferred from full-time to part-time service with the Australian Army in 2011. Marcus.
I've had the privilege of serving my country on military operations in 4 very different theatres and circumstances. In each of these, I was part of a coalition of national military forces operating in a foreign territory. When I was first approached to speak at this event, it prompted me to reflect that the wars that I had experienced did not so much end as much as witness a reduction in the amount of fighting. From a national perspective, the wars ended for us when our national contributions returned to Australia, but often the fighting and violence continued and evolved in nature. I regard these events as inflection points when a situation, and in some circumstances, the nature of the conflict changed. I'd like to relate my perception of these events and some personal anecdotes from my experiences serving in Afghanistan, Haiti, East Timor, and Iraq. In terms of common themes drawn from what I have seen, I think that in order for a country or a place to transition from a state of fighting to a state of peace, an integrated effort by soldiers, police, and civilians working to an agreed plan is required. So let's first travel back to Afghanistan in the early 1990s. When the USSR withdrew its military forces from Afghanistan in 1989, it left behind a regime, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, or DRA, under the leadership of Mohammad Najibullah. The international community did not expect the DRA to endure, and the UN planned on the repatriation of millions of refugees from the war located in Iran and mostly in Pakistan. Part of that activity was an effort to clear millions of landmines that had been laid, both by the Soviets and DRA forces, as well as the Mujahideen forces. With material and financial support from the USSR, the DRA held out against the Mujahideen resistance, even though by the beginning of 1991, the DRA government controlled only 10% of Afghanistan. But the expected repatriation of refugees did not eventuate, so the landmine clearance program operated between the fighting between the DRA and Mujahideen forces from 1989 until early 1992, when the Najibullah regime collapsed. The collapse was principally linked to the withdrawal of financial and material support from the disintegrating USSR. At the time, I was based in Peshawar in April 1992 when the collapse occurred. In rapidly changing circumstances that were reminiscent of this year's collapse of the Afghan National Army against the Taliban, I noted at the time that Afghans have an innate ability to sniff the wind and flip their allegiance very, very quickly. And perhaps more unusually, Afghans seem to accept that this action is a normal and rational practice. Perhaps there is more that unites them than divides them. There does not seem to be a need for a truth and reconciliation measures to reconcile former foes in Afghanistan. It is simply accepted that allegiances change over time in an ever-shifting competition for power and influence. The remaining DRA strongholds across Afghanistan fell or flipped in the space of a couple of weeks. That war ended very quickly and with remarkable little fighting. Again, the parallels with recent events in Afghanistan are clear, and it's a wonder that this phenomenon was not more readily foreseen. And sadly, as we know, that Mujahideen victory in Afghanistan didn't last very long before degenerating into inter-faction rivalry and violence, giving rise to the Taliban not long after. But I'm pleased to report that the UN-sponsored demining effort in Afghanistan continues to this day. Turning now to Haiti. In late 1994, I saw an example of the coercive power of the US military. A coup d'etat led by Raul Cedras ousted elected President Jean-Bertrand Aristide in 1991. The US's relationship with Haiti and its rulers is a long and complex saga. Suffice to say that after some time, the US's tolerance of Cedrus's violent rule came to an end. After securing the legal authority to restore President Aristide with UNSCR 940 in July of 1994, a US delegation then began negotiations to convince Cedrus to step down. When negotiations stalled, Operation Uphold Democracy was launched. Cedrus was shown a video of the 82nd Airborne Division troops loading onto aircraft. While allowing Cedrus to process the sight, he was informed that while he assumed he was watching a live feed, he was in fact viewing a video captured more than 2 hours before. And as such, the lead elements of the 3,900 strong paratrooper force had already launched from Fort Bragg in North Carolina and were currently en route. The delegation relayed that a forced entry airborne assault on the island nation would in all likelihood result in Haiti coming under US control within hours. To remove all uncertainty from Cedrus's mind, he was reminded by the delegation that the 82nd Airborne had also spearheaded overwhelmingly decisive victories during Operation Urgent Fury in Grenada and Operation Just Cause in Panama in the recent past. Cedrus capitulated and US forces arrived in Haiti with almost no resistance from his military. Aristide was returned to power, and after a few months, the US transferred security responsibilities to a UN peacekeeping force. I recall that there was considerable effort to train a police force using a US-based contractor comprised largely of former US police. This is a rare example, I think, of how the threat of overwhelming force by a third party can be applied to effect a peaceful transition of national authority, and a valuable lesson on the utility of force to me as a young captain at the time. Turning now to East Timor. Throughout 1999, the ADF planned for the evacuation of Australian nationals from East Timor in the event of increased violence resulting from the conduct and result of the independence referendum. The Army's 3rd Brigade planned to conduct an evacuation in a non-permissive environment. Other ADF force elements planned and ultimately conducted an evacuation in a permissive environment under the aegis of Operation Spitfire. But in the days after the results of the referendum were announced, the level of violence increased and ultimately the international community clamoured for an intervention. At short notice, the 3rd Brigade plans for the non-permissive evacuation were adapted to provide protected areas under the aegis of Operation Warden. The kernel of Australian forces was quickly augmented with other international forces in what became Interfet. Interfet was able to assert control of security across East Timor in the space of several weeks. The force dealt with 2 security challenges. The first was the withdrawal of Indonesian forces from the territory in the few weeks following the referendum. There was a considerable degree of unhappiness and resentment towards Australia, and this manifested itself in much looting, arson, and threats of violence, and thankfully never turned into gunfights between Indonesian and Australian soldiers. The second security challenge was the anti-independence or pro-integration militias that were armed and applied violence against civilians and occasionally towards Interfet troops. Suffice to say that Interfet was able to convince these actors that it now held the security authority. So Interfet is an example where a military force can assert control with the object of reducing the level of violence. Not ending a war per se, but certainly transitioning a geographic region from one level of violence to a much lesser level. And as you know, Interfet then transferred responsibility for security to a UN peacekeeping force. And lastly, turning to Iraq. The war in Iraq was in its sixth agonising year when I joined it in mid-2008. There's insufficient time to recount the history and context of this particular war. Suffice that I arrived after the Sunni awakening, at the end of the surge, and while the Iraqi security forces grew in size and confidence. So overall, the security situation was improving. In this case study, I'd like to concentrate on how this war nearly ended in December of 2008. I was an action officer with the CJ3 staff, or the operations staff at Headquarters Multinational Forces Iraq, under the command of US Army 4-star General Ray Odierno. An action officer is a military euphemism for a staff officer to fix any crappy problem that comes up. Each day could bring a new, unexpected challenge, and some of them were big, ugly challenges. For several years, the UN had been authorising the presence and work of the multinational force through a UNSCR that had been periodically renewed. I'm not fully aware of the diplomatic context, but in 2008, this UNSCR was apparently not going to be re-sponsored and renewed at the end of the year. The US was in the process of negotiating a bilateral status of forces agreement, or SOFA, with the Iraqi government, which each troop contributing nation would then duplicate with their own bilateral SOFA. Suffice that the US-Iraqi bilateral negotiations were the linchpin and were not going well. Indeed, they seemed at an impasse. General Odierno patiently waited for the diplomats to do their best, but the Iraqi leadership knew that they had considerable leverage given the US interests and the large scale of the US commitment. Military planners often have to consider contingencies, and eventually General Odierno had to confront the question of what if the bilateral agreement doesn't get signed? Enter action officer fielding. When I received the task to begin contingency planning for such an event, my life was consumed by the implications of this potential future for the next several weeks. I won't delve into the details of my journey during those weeks. Suffice to say that there wasn't much sleep. There were several sensitive decision briefs to all the senior coalition leaders, and I suddenly found myself at the planning centre for the 150,000 strong coalition force. I ended up drafting the orders for the standing down and complete withdrawal of coalition forces in the event that the bilateral agreements were not made by the end of 2008. It was almost surreal that circumstances and a few sheets of paper could bring a stop to this massive undertaking. And in typical fashion, just days before the UNSCR expired, the diplomats made a deal. The US referred to the bilateral agreement as the US-Iraqi Security Agreement. Tellingly, the Iraqis, reflecting the tensions and mood of the day, referred to it as the agreement between the United States of America and the Republic of Iraq on the withdrawal of United States forces from Iraq and the organisation of their activities during their temporary presence in Iraq. The Iraqi government was ready for the US-led coalition of the willing to leave, and felt capable of running the country. My planning work over the last several weeks had been relegated to the contingency planning dustbin of military history. The next day, I started work on yet another project. The Australian government, in turn, secured its own bilateral SOFA with Iraq, but within 6 months, the ADF contingent was withdrawn. Australia's war had ended, and the US war ended with the departure of their combat forces in December of 2011, as per the security agreement. But as we know, the war in Iraq evolved and continued in different forms. So in conclusion, Australia, Afghanistan, Haiti and Iraq all continue to experience levels of violence higher than what we would consider to be acceptable in the rest of the world. None of these countries, nor Timor Leste, has subsequently become a peaceful and prosperous nation. The key challenge seems to be how a place or country transitions from a state of fighting to a state of peace. Soldiers and police are an essential part of this transition to keep the peace, but perhaps a more important part are civilians and resources to build the peace or reconstruct a society. And those civilians are not just diplomats or humanitarian aid types, but civilians who can organise and train Indigenous capability and capacity across the private and public sectors. The US, the UK and Australia have all experimented with organisations and doctrine to manage such a venture, but as yet there seems no obvious model. Of course, it is challenging for external parties to bring about that change when the Indigenous population has not bought into such a pathway. The UN's peacekeeping force model has had more success than US-led coalitions in recent decades, largely because the military, police, and civilian dimensions are better applied, and perhaps the Indigenous populations were more amenable. But in some cases, the level of violence prevents a UN-led approach, and in many instances, coalitions of the willing and the UN have both been present. The ending of wars remains a very challenging space. I'd like to think that some of these 4 countries I served in are continuing to make progress towards peace and prosperity, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have made a contribution. Thank you for the opportunity to tell a little bit about my experiences and perspectives. Thank you.
Marcus, in your description of the post-Russian Taliban takeover, you talked about this flipping of allegiances amongst the troops, particularly the Afghan army, and talked about the similarities between what, of course, happened earlier this year. And you described it as a rational approach. Do you think that this is absolutely specific to the Afghan environment, this kind of rationality, bearing in mind that many wars are more based on sectarianism and ethnicity, perhaps, than in Afghanistan? Or are there aspects of what happened back then, and indeed this year, that can be applicable elsewhere, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question, Richard. Thank you. Obviously, I've got some first-hand experience of Afghanistan almost 30 years ago now, and it was a feature that I observed then, and it was interesting to observe it again just this year with the more recent circumstances. But I think it boils down to human nature. It's about surviving, and you compromise your position when it's in your interest to continue to survive. And I would make the observation that at a sort of personal and a family level, the Afghans and the Pathans in particular, through their Pushtun Wali code, do carry grudges not grudges, that's a Western term. I'm just trying to think of the local term, but they do carry grudges, for years, if not generations. And so they're obviously a very proud people, and revenge for grievances is something that is part of their culture. But by the same token, you know, there's an environment where there's strong men and people who have allegiance to strong men. And if the strong men decide that they want to change their allegiance, then basically the group follows with them. So it's not so much every soldier, you know, having a vote and then deciding that they're going to flip their allegiance. It really is just a case of the commander, you know, making that decision and everyone follows. So, you know, I don't know about parallels in other theatres and countries, but I do know enough about human nature that, you know, when the circumstances change, your position perhaps has to change with it. And I use the term sniff the wind. But, you know, I'm sure that in other circumstances, there have been occasions when commanders and perhaps large groups of people have flipped their allegiance or worst case, just simply decided to surrender because you know, they've formed a view that their cause is futile. But I think, you know, in a more tribal society, you know, your group can then flip its allegiance and then become part of that groundswell of movement. So it's an interesting phenomenon. I'm not a sociologist or ethnographer, so I'd have to defer to, you know, some of the experts in that field as to why that is a human condition. But yeah, I think if you looked at history, you'll probably find a lot more a lot more examples than I've identified in my career.
Thank you.
Yeah. Really interesting presentation, and I like the fact that you can talk about a number of case studies. They seem, from one perspective, they seem to fall into two groups: Afghanistan and Iraq, and Haiti and East Timor. Haiti and East Timor were resolved essentially through the application of overwhelming force, at least relative to the actors on the ground at the time. Whereas Afghanistan and Iraq were influenced by significant force, but that force wasn't overwhelming and wasn't sufficient to dominate the conflict environment. I guess the question is overwhelming force a universal tool, or is it only specifically applicable? And to what extent is intervention, other than overwhelming intervention, able to be successful?
Yeah, thanks, Damien. Look, I'm not sure that there's any hard and fast rules or deductions that we can make in that regard. I know, for example, in both East Timor and Haiti, you know, the local population wanted to move on to the next stage. East Timor, in the broad, wanted to become independent. Haiti wanted to be rid of its despot and return back to a democracy. And so even though there was, you know, what we would consider to be large-scale use of force, you know, the indigenous population was amenable to that change. I think less so in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, even though you know, Al-Qaeda was supposedly defeated and the Taliban deposed, we all know that those forces were simply physically displaced. They weren't defeated as such. They simply moved to another safe space, regrouped, and came back. Same in Iraq. You know, we know that there was a lot of pro-Saddam groups that continued to exist below the surface, and in some cases moved across borders, only to come back. Iraq's a lot more complicated, obviously, because of the introduction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which largely was in response to the US intervention. So that then mixed things up once again. But I think, you know, overwhelming force is an interesting phenomena, and I can only harken back to World War II, which had a decisive victory for the Allies. Berlin was occupied. The Nazis were gone. There was absolutely no doubt that they had been defeated. Similarly with, well, perhaps even to a less degree with Japan, but I think in the modern wars, that notion of defeat and an acceptance of defeat and then a moving on to the next stage is a little bit more elusive. And it really, there are many examples where we think we've been victorious, but the people that we think we've been victorious against refuse to accept that judgment. So I think we need to be very careful about, mission accomplished and declaring victory when not all the parties accept that position.
Marcus, we talked about learning from experience, and you talked a lot about your experiences. And obviously it's really important to understand what happened and why, so that we can perhaps draw and learn lessons that might be applicable to different circumstances and different environments. So how good are we, do you think, as a nation, or indeed as a cohort of Western nations and indeed militaries, understanding what has just happened and drawing appropriate lessons for the future?
Yeah, look, I don't think we're very good, Richard, largely because, we don't have the time to think about some of these things. I know in the immediate lee of 9/11, decisions were being made very, very quickly. We got in bed with the only group that was anti-Taliban at the time, which was the Northern Alliance. And somehow they became the great saviors of Afghanistan, but they've always been a relatively minor part of the population there. So I was astounded that the US-led coalition could think that it could displace the largely Pashtun population from the political process and somehow still be victorious. So that whole understanding of the ethnic composition of a country, what its history is, who the players are, where the balance of power lies, what is almost a natural evolution, even though it can be shaped a little bit by external forces. I think we really could learn a lot more from ethnographers, and unfortunately they don't tend to be in national security cabinets, and they come out later, or they might write an article that say, hang on, have a think about this, guys, before you get involved, but it really is just a little bit too late. And I think it's an interesting example now of the war in Afghanistan ending just this year. I think it'll take a long, long time for historians and other analysts to actually understand what happened and what went wrong and where were the information gaps. So unfortunately, it's a long process because the world is a complex place, and when you're a politician, complexity is not a good thing. You need to make a quick decision, and sometimes they are emotional decisions, and so. It's something I don't think we can necessarily become a lot better at, unless, of course, we slow the whole process down, and that's not going to happen. So I think we find that we continue to get stuck in these situations where we're sort of running headlong into situations that aren't going to work out neatly and easily. But I think that's the nature of human society and human history.
Marcus, you referred to multilateral interventions as having a different structure and perhaps a different success rate. You referred to not only military forces, but police, development workers, and so on. Is that a you think that there's a broad application of that distinction between unilateral and multilateral interventions? And just on the back of that, is it necessary, do you think, to create at the outset a plan for a restabilising a post-conflict environment?
Look, I'd like to think that the trouble is, politicians make the decision to intervene. Military planners take care of the military dimension, achieve some sort of victory or security, stability in some degree. And often what do we do with this place now that we own it question doesn't come up until a little later on down the path. And I know both in Iraq and Afghanistan, the poor old military was then left holding the baby and trying to rebuild, reconstruct the country. And in the early or mid-2000s, there was a huge demand for non-military people to come in and assist with the rebuilding. So I know not only the US, but the UK and Australia all developed various models for what they would call civilian stabilisation forces, some sort of paramilitary, organised effort to go into these places and help build the peace, reconstruct. Now, my understanding is that that was a response to the problems that the military were experiencing in Iraq and Afghanistan. We know that they achieved some degree of capability in generating those civilians and police, for that matter. All of these different agencies and organisations were involved in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Achieved some degree of success, but arguably didn't get to the point where the country was peaceful and prosperous and capable of running things on their own volition. But unfortunately, now that those wars have both sort of ended, those capabilities to augment or to work in parallel with the military force have now been disestablished, run down, because it's one thing to keep soldiers, on notice, ready for contingencies. It's another thing to keep civilians on notice, ready for contingencies. And so our ability to mobilise, some sort of civilian peace building force is almost back down to zero, and we'll probably reinvent that requirement, the next time. And I just go back to, experiences like World War II, of course, just as a student of history. I know we had, once, German forces were defeated, there had to be a civilian administration brought in, and the military at the time, trained military officers to be able to be the mayor of, whatever city in Germany. And, that lasted for several years. We probably had a whole body of doctrine on how to do that and how to make that transition back to the civilian authority. But we lost it. I don't know where it is in history. We had to reinvent that for Iraq and Afghanistan. I think we're at risk of losing that knowledge, institutional knowledge or global knowledge again, because it doesn't, it's an expensive thing to maintain. And if you don't have the, immediate imperative to use it, there's no reason to maintain it. And so we'll lose that again. And I could almost bet that there'll be another military-led intervention at some stage in the future, where at some point someone's going to say, well, where are the civilians to help build the peace? And we'll have to reinvent that, again. And it'll be, a similar challenge for both, the same countries, the US, Canada, the UK, perhaps even Australia and New Zealand, depending on which country we're intervening in at that time. Okay.
Okay, Marcus, Damien, thank you. I think we've come to probably the end of our time.
And to conclude this session, we have Dr. David Kilcullen. David is a former soldier and diplomat and a scholar of guerrilla warfare, terrorism, urbanisation and the future of conflict, who served 25 years with the Australian and United States governments. During the Iraq War, he served in Baghdad as a member of the Joint Strategic Assessment Team, then as Senior Counterinsurgency Advisor, Multinational Force Iraq in 2007, before becoming Special Advisor for Counterinsurgency to US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice in 2008. In Afghanistan, he founded the ISAF Counterinsurgency Advisory Assistance Team in 2009 and served as advisor to Commander ISAF and was Senior Research Scientist on the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency's Afghanistan Country Project. David.
Well, thank you for having me. It's really great to be part of this conference, and obviously the subject of how wars end is particularly personal for me, since we've just lived through the disastrous failure of a 2-decade Western effort in Afghanistan, a war that we've been trying to end almost since it began. As George Orwell pointed out in 1946, the quickest way to end a war is to lose it, and that's what we've just done. So the US, along with its allies like Australia, a range of international institutions, including the UN, have been decisively defeated. So what I'd like to do is use what just happened in Afghanistan as a bit of a case study to think about some of the dynamics of how these kinds of wars tend to end. The collapse of 2021 seemed to come very quickly at the end, but its roots actually stretch back to at least 2014. When ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, withdrew from Afghanistan at the end of that year, we transitioned from a counterinsurgency strategy to what's called security force assistance. Under the COIN strategy, the counterinsurgency strategy, we carried the main combat burden. And our goal was not to completely defeat the Taliban, but rather to weaken them to the point where the Afghans could take the lead with our support for the long haul. That was sort of epitomized by President Obama's surge strategy of the middle years of ISAF. But that was unfortunately undermined from the outset because President Obama, in the very speech that he gave announcing the surge, also announced that it would end in July 2011. And I actually happened to be sitting in a restaurant in Kabul with two very strongly pro-Taliban negotiators from Kandahar while that speech was happening. And at the end of it, they were shaking their heads in amazement. One of them said, you know, are you guys deliberately trying to lose the war? And the other one said, you know, tomorrow, Taliban's going to go out on the street and they're going to say to people, you just heard President Obama's speech. You might like the Americans, but they're leaving in July. What are you guys doing in August? And so in the end, we actually delayed our departure by a couple more years. But we basically stuck to a timetable throughout the counterinsurgency period. And the idea was that we would sort of helpfully tell the Taliban exactly how long they needed to wait until we were going to go. And of course, that's exactly what they did. They needed to maintain a certain amount of effort inside the country to stay in the fight. But throughout the surge, they pretty carefully calibrated their activity and withheld their main effort, keeping most of their forces safe in Pakistan and just waiting for us to leave. Now, as the surge came to an end in 2014, we had done a fair bit of damage to them, but we had really not done anything at all to the large bulk of their forces that remained in Pakistan. And we patted ourselves on the back and said, well, we've defeated them because we saw the level of activity declining. But in fact, that was just the Taliban waiting until we left before ramping themselves back up again. And under that post-surge SFA or security force assistance structure, that's exactly what they did. They began to, as we wrapped up and handed over to what was called Resolute Support in 2015, we replaced our combat brigades with what we called Train, Advise, and Assist commands. We stepped back from combat to a supporting role. And under that model, the Afghans were now carrying the bulk of the combat burden. We handed off governance and development and basically just stepped back. And as a result, the Taliban, as they ramped up after we left at the end of the surge, were fighting an Afghan military that had been built up over preceding years, but wasn't really ready to handle the fact that they suddenly came roaring back when ISAF departed. Now, after 2015, that approach that we had taken in military and economic terms was completely sustainable for us. Our casualty rates dropped away dramatically. You know, during the surge, we were averaging about 34 people killed per month. Once we went to SFA after 2015, it was about 1 a month. So dramatic drop, about 96% drop in our casualties. Likewise, during the height of the counterinsurgency campaign, we were spending around $100 billion US per year during that surge period. After the surge was over, we went to SFA, it dropped off to about 60 billion a year. So we could have sustained that for the long term had we had the political will to do that. But it's worth noting our coalition casualties dropped by 96%, but the money we were spending only dropped by about 40%. So that sort of reflects the harsh reality that after 2015, we were still largely paying for the war, but we weren't actually fighting it. It was the Afghans doing the bulk of the fighting. And that was the critical problem, because even though the structure after 2015 might have been sustainable for us, it was unsustainable for the Afghans. You know, total coalition deaths in the entire war were about 3,500, and the vast majority of those happened during the surge. By contrast, the Afghan military and police lost about 70,000 people killed over the same period, and most of those deaths happened after the surge when they began to carry the bulk of the combat burden. So that loss rate was just too high to be sustainable over time for them. So what happened after 2015 was we got into this annual cycle where there'd be a major Taliban offensive every spring, which would seize a lot of territory, particularly in areas around the ring road, the highway that connects the major cities. Each fighting season, they would push police and military garrisons out of isolated outposts in rural districts. And then later in the year, there'd be a government counteroffensive, which would recapture most, but crucially not all, of that territory, while simultaneously losing a lot of Afghan police and military to do that. Also from 2015 onward, we saw the Taliban focusing very heavily on large offensives that targeted cities, particularly provincial capitals. And even when they weren't running major offensives, they were focusing a lot of terrorist activity on the cities. And that meant that the police and the military had to divert a lot of effort to securing cities away from rolling the Taliban back in the countryside. Also, after 2015, there was a whole new actor in the conflict in the form of ISIS, which really came into its own after 2015. So it's a much more complicated conflict with a lot fewer resources that the Taliban were inflicting on the government. So in effect, with each successive year, the Taliban got stronger, we progressively pulled back, new combatants like ISIS turned up, government control in the countryside was eroding, and they were being forced to spread themselves more and more thinly to defend an increasing number of localities. And with every annual cycle, the government found itself further and further behind the power curve, where it didn't start each year from the same position as the preceding one, but actually from slightly further behind the 8 ball. One key reason for that, counterintuitively, was how good and how large the Afghan special forces were. From 2011 onward, we put a huge amount of effort into growing special forces, and probably after 2015, they were just much too big for the size of the overall Afghan military. The military sociologist Roger Beaumont pointed out in a classic book in 1974 called Military Elites, that when you take an elite element like a soft component and make it too big in comparison to its parent organization, it can have a net negative effect. It creates basically a brain drain where it sucks the talent out of the main force, and individuals who would have been NCOs or junior officers in the big military end up being individual soldiers in the elite. That's one side of the problem. The other side is we then throw those elite forces into dangerous and difficult situations so that their loss rate tends to be larger or higher than the main force. So we're effectively selectively weeding out the best fighters, putting them in the most dangerous places, and then losing them at a higher rate. So over time, that selection destruction cycle actually damages the combat effectiveness of the force as a whole. From 2015 onward, that cycle was running rampant in both the Afghan military and the police. We used those elite units as fire brigades, rushing around the country, responding to crises, reinforcing threatened areas, doing the bulk of the fighting to recapture areas that have been taken by the Taliban. And the average ordinary unit lost progressively its will to fight and began to rely more and more on the fact that it was going to be bailed out by these elite forces. And so that further drove down the performance of the Afghan forces. Also, over time, corruption at the higher level and lack of resources at the lower level meant that garrisons out in the countryside often found themselves cut off. They didn't have the resources they needed. Their pay was often getting siphoned away to corrupt officials in the capital cities. And as a consequence, they tended to extort the local population or abuse the local population in order to get the resources they needed. And that, of course, generated huge contempt and anger on the part of the locals, made local people more willing to support the Taliban. And it meant that all these outer garrisons were basically fighting to survive rather than building a relationship with the community, which allowed them to go on the offensive against the Taliban. So the other, I guess, point that we saw in terms of unsustainability was the fact that, we had about 210 bases as ISAF across Afghanistan. When we rolled out of there at the end of 2014, the Afghan military that was left behind could only really garrison about 80 of those 200 bases. But once an area had been occupied, the government's prestige was very highly tied up in that, and they found it really difficult to withdraw. And so they insisted year after year, encouraged by us, on recapturing all of the lost ground for reasons of prestige. But over time, that really undermined their ability to sustain the effort. In the last couple of years of the Obama administration, we steadily drew down the number of our advisors. That actually ran counter to best practice counterinsurgency, by the way, where it's okay to draw down your combat forces, but you should try to compensate for that with an increase rather than a reduction in advisors. But it was all driven by domestic US politics and the need to end the war in Afghanistan, which, as I've mentioned, was quite sustainable in practical terms for us, but for political reasons, both President Obama and President Trump, who followed him, felt determined to end it. When President Trump came in, he initially seemed open to continuing the effort. He actually did a modest troop increase when he first arrived, and increased airstrikes and drone strikes to try to put more pressure on the Taliban to negotiate. But by the middle of 2018, President Trump, who's not famous for his patience, who had also campaigned on, ending what he called the ridiculous endless wars, he became frustrated by lack of progress on the ground, reversed his policy, started a series of talks with the Taliban over the head of the Afghan government, and basically began to fully withdraw. And by the end of 2020, there were only about 2,500 troops in Afghanistan, down from about 15,000 in the middle of 2018 when President Trump decided to withdraw. So, again, every US president since George W. Bush has been trying to end the war. But in this case, what we began to see was simply reducing troop numbers in accordance with domestic US policy priorities, rather than in line with any facts on the ground. And of course, it's worth pointing out that much of the discussion in Western capitals, but particularly in Canberra and in Washington, conflated strategy with troop ceiling, as if the strategy was the same as the number of troops. And that led us into a whole series of bad outcomes toward the end. As all of that was happening, the Taliban's strategy of steadily choking off those outlying outposts was starting to work. By early 2021, the strategy of patiently surrounding district centres through successive spring offensives had begun to put them into pole position for that year's campaign, the campaign of 2021. Then in mid-April, President Biden said, it's time to end America's longest war, announced that all US forces would be out by the end of, by the 20th anniversary of September 11. And Taliban leaders realized, I think for the first time, that the spring offensive that they'd already quietly launched might actually be the last one, and they might actually be able to win the entire war in 2021. So let's turn quickly to what actually happened in 2021. The Taliban campaign started in March, series of small and medium-sized attacks at the district level. They focused on picking off those garrisons that were already isolated. Often they would partially encircle them and then send in a local elder, often somebody well known to the garrison, to negotiate a surrender. And those that agreed to a surrender and handed over all their equipment were allowed to leave peacefully. Those who didn't and fought would often be crushed, and then the garrison would be massacred to send a lesson to others. Even for otherwise motivated commanders, the fact that we began to dramatically cut back international air support, surveillance and reconnaissance and intelligence, logistics, maintenance support after May this year meant that all those local garrisons rapidly began to run out of everything: ammunition, medical supplies, fuel, food, water. It became impossible to resupply them by helicopter, and the road resupply convoys became fewer and further in between. Garrison commanders knew they were basically on their own. Their soldiers knew if they got injured, there was no way they could be evacuated. So morale began to really collapse after May. And the blow to morale was dramatically accelerated once we pulled out of Bagram Air Base in July without even coordinating with the Afghans, who very clearly got the message that they were out in the cold. Through May, June, and July, an increasing number of district centres began to fall. Same technique, but it began to be applied at the province level, where they would do this partial encirclement, negotiation, and surrender, often also paying a lot of money to garrison commanders, mayors, even provincial governors, to get them to stop fighting or switch sides. And in that way, they succeeded in capturing vast amounts of terrain and military equipment with very little fighting and very few casualties. There was also a network effect, right? So government garrison commanders might have thought, well, look, I can fight on, but if everybody else is surrendering, there's no point. I'll just be slaughtered for no purpose, even if I tried to fight. By mid-July, Afghan SOF was fighting frantically to hold the key cities of Kandahar and Lashkar and Helmand. And that's where that selection destruction cycle finally peaked. And Afghanistan's best troops, who otherwise could have been holding the capital in Kabul or stiffening every other garrison, were bled white in these decisive battles in these two southern cities. While that was going on, the Taliban began pushing into the northern part of the country, aiming to prevent the government from consolidating in the north, and successfully began to seize provincial capitals. Now, suddenly then, in the beginning of August, we saw the war begin to appear to speed up. And in just an 9-day period between the 6th of August and the 15th of August, we saw every provincial capital in the country collapse. And we saw, in some cases, dozens of district centers collapsing, and then 5 or 8 or even 10 provincial capitals collapse every day of that final 9-day campaign. So the war sort of suddenly appeared to accelerate. And this is where once the war began to accelerate, even if we'd had the political will to go back in, which we certainly didn't for political reasons, there's very little we could do. And we could have surged air support to bolster the ANA, but because we'd given up on Bagram, we didn't have the ability to quickly turn around and support the ANA. We had to fly very long distances, about an 8-hour round trip, 8-hour each way trip to Afghanistan from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, or from the decks of carrier aircraft in the Arabian Sea, just to get to the battle area. And then aircraft would have as little as 40 minutes on station before they'd have to go back. So, we just were not able to stem that rapid process of collapse once it began to accelerate to that point. And of course, it had a massive morale effect as well, because even after really the Battle of Kandahar in July and August of 2021, there was effectively no international air support for the Afghans. By 10th of August, we saw this just accelerating collapse begin to knock out basically every major capital. On the 12th and 13th of August, Afghan special forces in Kandahar and Lashkar finally collapsed. At that point, Kabul was left basically wide open. A couple of ordinary divisions with poor morale and limited equipment, and then the remnants of special forces, but otherwise open. And from Friday the 13th, the final collapse began. Kandahar and Lashkar fell. The next day, about a dozen cities fell. Mazar-i-Sharif, the critical northern city, fell late on Friday evening. By Sunday, the 15th of August, the final two areas, Jalalabad in the east and Kandahar, collapsed, and the Taliban had won. So to wrap up, I want to talk about why the military collapsed and why the political system of Afghanistan collapsed. As I think I've outlined, the collapse started off slowly and barely noticeably at first from 2015, but it finally reached a tipping point somewhere around May of 2021. And then the war began to accelerate rapidly, leading to this catastrophic disintegration of the Afghan military over the summer, and then this astonishingly rapid collapse of the Afghan civil government over a period of just a few days in August. Actually, that shouldn't really surprise us. Gordon McCormick, who's a professor at Naval Postgraduate School, almost 10 years ago, he and a research team wrote a seminal paper called Things Fall Apart, describing the endgame dynamics of internal wars and showing that states tend to have an accelerating collapse curve. He talked about how they pass a tipping point, they begin to decay at an accelerating rate because they have all these moving parts that have to work together. And when one part of the system begins to collapse, the whole thing begins to degrade. And by the time, to quote McCormick, by the time the conflict enters that final phase and the time the state disintegrates, the conflict seems to speed up. By contrast, insurgencies decline at a decelerating rate, which is what we saw during the surge. So arguably, in a material sense, when we pulled out our support in May of 2021, that was the tipping point. And after that, they began to accelerate in terms of their collapse. I've likened it elsewhere to like a tower of Jenga blocks. We built the Afghan military in a way that it required certain critical capabilities to come from the international community. And then in May 2021, we whipped those capabilities out, which, by the way, is something we promised the Afghans we would never do under any circumstances. And that destroyed their morale, but it also meant that the system, which was built around those capabilities, just couldn't collapse and couldn't survive anymore, and rapidly collapsed. After that tipping point, even more damaging than that material effect of pulling out those capabilities was just a ruinous morale effect on an ANA, an Afghan military that already felt itself to be betrayed by corrupt leaders in Kabul, and whose soldiers could see us and their own politicians talking peace with the Taliban and organizing their own escape while simultaneously pushing the troops into combat. And when that all came home to roost, it just brought that accelerating collapse. And once several garrisons had collapsed, the network effect took hold, more fell, which brought more down, which led to the provincial garrisons collapsing, and so on, and finally that final collapse of Kabul. It's worth pointing to why the civil government collapsed as well. And I think the isolation of President Ghani is probably the key factor. He had failed to garner more than a small percentage of the vote in either of his previous elections. He got an even smaller proportion in one of the lowest turnout elections in Afghan history in 2019. He had minimal support from the population. His support base was largely in the urban elite and the international community. But weirdly, he was also kind of disconnected from his own government. He was a very irascible, pedantic guy who fired people at a just dramatically fast turnover, and just the amount of turnover of senior civilian and military leaders was astonishing for several years, actually, before the final collapse. And it meant that there was just very limited coherence in the top level of the Afghan government. At the same time, provincial and local officials in many cases had minimal ties to their own regions. They were drawn from a rentier elite that relied on us for support, for access to all the resources that protected their power. So once we left in 2015, they didn't have really anything to offer their communities. I think also crisis reveals character. Certainly that was true of President Biden, but it was also true of President Ghani, who was just right up to the last day focused on the administrative trappings of power rather than on fighting for his survival while district after district was collapsing out in the countryside. We could have done many things differently. I won't address those now, but literally millions of things we could have done differently throughout the course of the war to make things go better. But I think obviously enough, the macro point here is that throughout the war from the very beginning, we were more interested in ending it than in winning it. And as I said at the beginning, from George Orwell's perspective, I think it's true here as well. The quickest way to end a war, and probably the easiest, is just to lose it. We were looking for a graceful exit from about 2001. And that meant that we just didn't have the will to fight when the chips were down at the end. And it meant that we built an Afghan government that didn't have the ability to sustain itself when we got into that crisis. I think probably the most important thing, though, that we did wrong was that we persistently underestimated the Taliban. Maybe it was just how quickly we won in 2001, or the fact that they lacked material capability for much of the war, or the fact that they were, rustic guys who dressed in a particularly traditional way and spoke in an uncouth way. Whatever the reason, across 2 decades, every aspect of the effort, we consistently underestimated the enemy. As a fighting force, as a political organization, as a nationalist propaganda critique of the government, as a parallel governance structure or a social movement, we just never took the Taliban seriously enough at any time during the war, at least until they took our partner government down in a matter of a week or two in 2021. So in the final analysis, I think the war in Afghanistan ended principally as a result of lack of will. Neither the Afghans nor us went down gamely fighting to the last. Rather, what happened in 2021 was somewhere between a surrender on the part of the Afghans and a betrayal by us. It was indeed one of the most momentous disasters of Western foreign policy for at least 50 years, since the 1970s. Indeed, in many ways, it combined all the worst features of the US defeat in Saigon in 1975 with the Iran hostage crisis in 1979, but on a far grander scale. There are now thousands upon thousands of American citizens, allied citizens, including Australians, green card holders and Afghan allies who are left behind, and are basically a mass hostage crisis, which forces us to treat the Taliban very differently. Our defeat in Afghanistan was a massive morale boost for basically every jihadist group on the planet. The scrappy little Taliban, who everybody wrote off for 2 decades, succeeded in defeating the all-powerful superpower through persistence, continuing to believe in the one true God, maintaining faith in the ultimate victory, and within two generations, defeating two major superpowers. So overall, I think it was an asymmetry of will. They wanted it more than we did. We wanted to leave more than we wanted to win. And then, as I've described, the end game dynamics of the conflict in 2021 led to this tipping point in May, rapid acceleration after July, and then this final collapse in a heap over a matter of 9 days in August. So let me stop there, and I'm going to throw it back to the group, and we can talk about everything I've said in a bit more detail.
David, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I got lots of questions which we won't have time for to address all of them. But the first one relates to Obama's speech. He made it very clear that although he was speaking presumably for domestic consumption, telling Americans that this war isn't going on forever, it was interpreted in a very, what appeared to be a very dangerous way, obviously by the Taliban in the theatre. And I just wondered whether in a liberal democracy, that is something that we just have to accept, that we have to speak to our local populations, and that's always going to undermine our ability to win conflicts elsewhere. But I just also was taken by your comment about that the strategy equals troop numbers. And I assume this, started, I think, probably with the Iraq surge, where it appears that the surge was the strategy rather than the fact that the strategy was something very different, which was enabled by the increased troop numbers. And I just wondered, what does this say about the political military interface in Washington, D.C.? Where were, the generals whose responsibility it is, whose duty it is to proffer sound military advice to the civilian government? And was the advice not forthcoming, or were they just not listened to? So there are really two questions there. One about the nature of democracy, and the other about political military interface.
Yeah. So look, to dispatch the first question quickly, the answer to that is yes, right? Western politicians tend to talk to their own domestic audiences because that's who votes for them, and they tend to shape their remarks around that domestic audience and what it wants to hear. Also, more particularly in the US, presidents tend to get elected on the basis of domestic policy, not foreign policy, and so there's a desire to sort of focus on, pocketbook concerns, bread and butter issues for the population. And it's worth remembering, of course, that in 2009, we were in the middle of the first year of a major global financial crisis. And that was by far President Obama's main focus, as was Obamacare, which is a major healthcare reform that he really committed all of his political capital to in 2009. So he didn't have a lot of bandwidth for something else. And so by communicating that way, I think it's more or less a given. I'll just mention that the statement of when they were going to end the surge was a late addition to the speech, one that wasn't in the original version. It was written by the national security team, but was added by the president's political advisors right at the end, in fact, the night of the speech, without coordinating with the Pentagon for domestic political reasons. And without really thinking about it, kind of undercut the entire strategy. And that links to the troop numbers question. The reason that politicians wouldn't realize the impact or didn't care about the impact on their own strategy of communicating that way is that modern Western politicians tend to have zero or minimal military experience and understanding of actual military force. And I think it was Clomoso who said that war's too serious a matter to be left to the generals. And unfortunately, that is what we've done a lot in the West, where parliamentarians and politicians and cabinets tend to think about the politics, and they defer on the military piece to generals, and often don't understand the basis for the advice they're being given. So I would argue that we probably need to do a better job at educating politicians about how the military side works. On the military side, though, there's a lot of blame involved in how military leaders engaged with politicians throughout the war. In the specifics of the surge, General McChrystal, who was commanding at that time in ISAF, did a very detailed study of what he was going to need to do. He realized that the bulk of the fighting was in the south and the east, and he would need to suppress both of those areas in order to gain enough breathing space to build the Afghan military, as we've been talking about. He ran the numbers and decided that he needed about 45,000 troops to do both of those parts of the campaign simultaneously. He went back with those numbers to Washington. He was laughed out of the room in the Pentagon, and they said, guys, there's no way that the politicians are going to agree to that. So the politicians instead asked for 30,000 troops. They also trimmed down the discussion of why it was going to be done, but just to focus on the troop numbers. President Obama said, well, look, you've asked for 30,000, you can have 20,000. So McChrystal needed 45, asked for 30, got 20, and then looking at that said, well, I got less than half the troops I needed. I'm not going to be able to do both the South and the East simultaneously. The South is more critical. I'm going to do the South first and then switch to the East. And so he tried to do as in sequence what should really have been done together. And that was him reacting to the troop number ceiling that had been given. And of course, right when the southern part of the campaign had more or less succeeded and they were about to turn to the East, President Obama said, right, that's it, we're done. And we left. So they pulled the wool or pulled the rug out from under the strategy about halfway through. That doesn't mean it was going to work, right? It just means that military-civil dynamic was a key negative feature there. And the same thing happened this year as well, where when questioned on why on earth did you pull out of the main airbase and leave only one airfield with one airstrip in downtown Kabul, for no decent reason, General Milley's response to that, and he's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and General McKenzie, who's the commander of the theater of Central Command, basically said, look, we had to take as a given that we had 2,500 troops in the troop ceiling, and we couldn't afford to hold both locations with just that number of troops. What they should have done is gone back to the president and said, we cannot do this with 2,500 troops. And arguably they should have resigned rather than carry out a strategy they knew to be flawed. But they went ahead and did it anyway on the direction of the president and his political advisors, who, as we said, didn't really know much about the military elements of the campaign. So long answer to a short question, but I think a very important couple of issues that you raised there.
Thanks, David. That was a great presentation, and there's an awful lot to unpack in that. I think what you're saying and what would be generally agreed is just about everything that could go wrong did go wrong. All of the things that should have been done weren't done. But there's a premise which I think is missing here, and that is that wars of occupation, unless they're total war, are borderline impossible to win in conventional terms. The Taliban saw the invasion as an occupation. They had nowhere else to go. They were always going to be there, unless they were all dead. On the other hand, you have the ISAF, who ultimately are going to go home, be it in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. They ultimately are not going to be there for eternity. So given that all the Taliban had to do was survive to win, how do wars of occupation actually conclude successfully?
So there's actually very good data on this. The RAND Corporation about 10 years ago did a study of 86 different campaigns of counterinsurgency and found that governments actually win about 80% of the time. So actually 4 out of 5 of these campaigns do end successfully. They even looked at whether you can still win even if you can't deny a sanctuary to the enemy. And of course, we never denied the sanctuary in Pakistan to the Taliban. And they found that even in those circumstances, about 6 out of 10 times, the government wins. But to your point, Damien, they also identified that a government that wins in those circumstances, the 8 out of 10 times when the government actually does win, almost always has two key factors in its favor. It is fighting in its own country, and it's willing to negotiate around the critical political issues that are driving the campaign. And those two features were just never present in Afghanistan. The Afghan government was treated as a puppet by the Afghans as much as by anybody else. As I highlighted, it drew its source of support from the international community, not from the Afghan people. So it had no reason to build those relationships. It wasn't responsive to the desire of its community. It never built that local legitimacy. The Taliban, if nothing else, were local and authentic and legitimate in the eyes of a lot of the population. I think also we misunderstood the Taliban's appeal. For our own reasons, Western governments tended to interpret the Taliban as an extremist religious movement. They were not actually extreme religiously in the eyes of many Afghans. There was a fascinating study done by the University of Sydney about 10 years ago, where they compared judgments rendered in Taliban courts with judgments rendered in government courts on an index of how religiously extreme they were, and found that they were about the same. No significant difference between what government judges and Taliban judges were ruling in courts. The difference was that the Taliban overwhelmingly were focusing on civil law, not criminal law. Disputes over land, divorces, local dispute mediation, land disputes, crop disputes. They were actually delivering a mediation service to the local population in a way that the government never did, because they didn't need to, because they didn't rely on support from the local community. And I think that built a really negative dynamic. And I think, the other point would be, we walked away from the counterinsurgency strategy about halfway through. So the counterinsurgency strategy that we started, as I mentioned, was not to defeat the Taliban, right? It was to drive the Taliban down while simultaneously building the Afghan military up and civil government up to the point where the local government could handle the enemy without us being there and doing most of the combat. And by 2015, we sort of talked ourselves into believing that that was true, but of course it wasn't. If we had successfully done that, what happens next is not that the enemy collapses, it's that it goes on for sometimes 20 or 30 years, but the local government handles it. A good example is Malaya, where after 1959, at no time did the insurgency represent a threat to the existence of the Malaysian government. They had ongoing support, but they handled it. Another good example, and I know this is your deep area of specialization, but in East Timor, at no time after 2001 did the militias and the Indonesian-backed opposition represent any kind of existential threat to the government in Dili. They had a period where they had an internal breakdown in 2005, 2006, and we responded by propping them back up again, which allowed them to continue to handle the issue. That doesn't mean that they're not still facing very severe issues internally. It just means that we successfully trimmed down the challenge to the point where they could handle it without us having to be permanently there, and we didn't walk away. And I talk about Australia and East Timor as a bit of a hybrid example, because yes, we're not from there, but we are from the region, and we have a long-term commitment over multiple generations, both sides of politics for different reasons, to East Timor, which means that we're very unlikely to walk away from that. The Americans and the Allies never had that in Afghanistan, and they just weren't in the same position as we were. So great point, and I think I would summarize your point, which I agree with, as being, as the Afghans used to say to us, you guys are fighting for counterterrorism, the local police and soldiers are fighting for pay, but the Taliban are fighting to free their nation from infidels. And that motivation is just much, much stronger. And I think at the end of the day, they wanted it more than we did. And as I said, we wanted to leave more than we wanted to win.
Just summarize the point that you raised there. The critical question in terms of the domestic government seems to be whether it's a legitimate government, whether it's seen to be legitimate in the eyes of the people. If it has legitimacy, it has a greater opportunity to overcome the challenges. If it doesn't have legitimacy in the eyes of a significant proportion of the population, then it's largely doomed to failure.
That's right. And I think, and this is very well understood by people that do this stuff for a living, right? That the fundamental thing you must achieve is legitimacy. Unfortunately, the World Bank, the UN, US government, Australian government have a very Eurocentric Western definition of legitimacy, which revolves around winning elections. And if you've won an election, you're considered to be legitimate. Even if you're not considered to be even from there. I mean, most of the senior leadership of the Afghan government had American, British, or even Australian passports as well. Many of them had their money overseas. They weren't seen as from there or legitimate in the eyes of Afghans. The US wasn't seen as an honest broker. Ashraf Ghani, the last president, lived in Afghanistan for hardly any of his life and worked for the World Bank for most of his career, and tended to regard the presidency of Afghanistan as a stepping stone to bigger and better things, such as running for being the Secretary General of the United Nations, right? So maybe that guy looked legitimate to people that worked for the World Bank or the UN, but he didn't look legitimate to Afghans. I'll give you one anecdote on that. During the 2009 election, I was out on the ground in Nangarhar, today a center of ISIS stronghold, but back then a bit of a swing district. And I was talking to locals about who they were going to vote for in the upcoming election. And I said, what do you guys think of Hamid Karzai, who was the president at the time? And they said, oh, he's corrupt. He's a thief. We hate him. And I said, oh, and who are you going to vote for? And they're like, oh, Karzai. And I was like, why? And they said, because his pockets are full. Right? If we vote for another guy, he now needs to catch up, right? And so the motivation that people really have is often dramatically different from what we think it might be looking from the outside. And I think that really tripped us up here, repeatedly.
One of the features that has dramatically changed, or appears dramatically to change, between 2001 and 2021 is in 2001, the Taliban were very clearly a Pashtun society organization. And they were defeated by an amalgam of the non-Pashtun Northern Alliance forces. So that war had an ethnic dimension which doesn't appear to be here this year. The northern provinces fell just as easily as the southern provinces. Why was that? And is it something to do with what we've been doing over the last 20 years, which is trying to strengthen national organizations and national aspects of Afghan society at the expense of the ethnic divisions?
Yeah. So firstly, you're absolutely right. On the day that the final Taliban stronghold, the city of Kandahar, fell in 2001, December the 7th, 2001, there was 110 CIA officers, about 300 special forces, including some Australians, and about a battalion of US Marines on the ground in Afghanistan. That was it. But there were 50,000 Afghans fighting with us against the Taliban, and they were overwhelmingly from the Northern Alliance: Tajik, Uzbek, Hazara, and some Pashtuns. There was an Eastern Pashtun alliance under Hamid Karzai fighting them as well. So it was really the Afghan population supported by US air power that defeated the Taliban in 2001. Why did that not happen in 2021? Some of it had to do with the Taliban and some of it had to do with us. To deal with us, first of all, we adopted an aid strategy early in the war that you can shorthand as red first, right? So we identified the red areas, the areas that were most violent, most unstable, and we pushed the bulk of our assistance into those areas. And that meant that a lot of that assistance was wasted. It wasn't very well accounted for. A lot of money flowed to the Taliban as a result of that. But in this context, the more important problem with that was that we really ignored the Northern Alliance areas where it wasn't dangerous and there wasn't a lot of fighting. And that was because people supported us. So for the first decade of the war, there were repeated conversations with people in the North where they said, guys, you know, we support you, that Pashtuns in the South are fighting you. How come you're giving them everything and you're not giving us anything? At one point, possibly apocryphal conversation between the German commander in Kunduz and a local community elder who said, hey, you know, the Pashtuns fight you and you give them money. We support you and you don't help us at all. How many people do we have to kill in order to get some aid around here, right? And that was the attitude that was fostered by doing that. More importantly, by 2021, the Taliban had exploited that, made significant inroads into the north, where there are big Pashtun populations actually, but scattered. But also there were even Hazara, Uzbek, and Tajik Taliban. They broadened their appeal to be a nationalistic one rather than an ethnic one. They'd focused on kicking out the infidels and the foreigners and what they called country sellers, so the people that had sold their country to the foreigners. It's also worth noting the change in their rhetoric over time, which was very infidel heavy at the beginning and became nationalist heavy at the end. They're foreigners. They're not from here. They're, you know, and all the Afghans that work for them have sold the country out. So it's a very nationalist appeal by the end. But then there's another element here, which is just the brilliance of the Taliban strategy. They realized what had happened in 2001. They put a huge amount of effort into building a northern Taliban, and they went after those northern cities really hard during the campaign, specifically to prevent the government from consolidating in the north. Now, this is a problem that's going to come back to bite them now, by the way, because the dominant Taliban faction in Kabul is the Haqqani network and a couple of others, backed by Pakistan. The northern Taliban, who rightly understand that they actually delivered the victory in 2021, they've been left out in the cold. They've got very little support and very little authority in the incoming Taliban government. And there's already rumblings of Taliban in the north saying, we picked the wrong side here. We should ally with the Tajiks and the Uzbeks. Also exacerbated by ISIS, now operating very heavily in the Shurbagan area in northwest Afghanistan. So everybody moved north regarding the northern terrain as critical once the campaign began. So a combination of things. And I would say, A, we screwed it up. B, the Taliban are just better than we ever gave them credit for. And different, right? Not just a bunch of religious extremists, but actually a very smart, highly motivated, nationally authentic liberation movement that managed to convince a lot of Afghans that that's exactly what they were.
Can I ask just one more question, which
Sure.
is really just following on from that? You said at the beginning that, you know, the quote of George Orwell, the quickest way to end a war is to lose it. Has the war in Afghanistan actually ended, do you think?
Yeah, so I actually was careful with my wording here. It was our war that ended. The war is not over. It's in a lull right now. The environment in Afghanistan is much more peaceful than it has been at any time in the last 20 years, but the war's not over. The underlying dynamics are still there. You've got Islamic State mounting an extremely intense campaign against the Taliban. I already mentioned the northern and southern dynamics, but there's also Pakistan versus Pashtun dynamics. There's a number of different factions. The most important thing to note about the word Taliban is it's a plural, right? It's not one Taliban. There's dozens of different factions. There's also an Afghan government in exile that's forming in Istanbul. Amrullah Saleh, the former vice president, claims to be the current president. The international community hasn't recognized the Taliban. So the war is far from over. But I would just flag, by far the most important challenge for Afghans right now is this massive humanitarian disaster that is about to hit them. The snow's already falling in northern Afghanistan. The winters are going to come down very soon. The country's been in a drought for the last year. 95% of Afghans now are experiencing some form of food insecurity, with outright famine breaking out in some key places. The Taliban are trying to get recognition from the international community. The international community is holding money and food aid as a bargaining counter against that Taliban desire for recognition. And I think we're actually heading into a very major humanitarian disaster where the Afghan people become the meat in the sandwich, and our own pride and injured dignity after our completely ridiculous screw up of 2021 prevents us from actually recognizing the reality that, hey, we lost, right? We were defeated. The Taliban beat us fair and square. They own and control Afghanistan now by right of conquest. And the last thing we should be doing now is killing potentially millions of Afghan civilians just to make ourselves better about ourselves. So I'm very worried that the war isn't over, but right now the major, most important thing is that humanitarian crisis. And I think if we care at all about the Afghans that we spent 20 years telling everyone that we care about, we need to focus on what's best for them, not what makes us feel better about 2021.
Thank you very much.
So on that rather somber note, we conclude the final panel in our conference on how wars end. A big thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their experiences and insights. There are clearly no easy answers, but please join us for our next and last session, Takeaways for Policymakers by Alan Gingell and Sarah Davies. Thank you.